unfortunately, it's feckless because unless you're going to put stress on China via sanctions or some other methodology, they're going to continue to supply Russia. And, we have seen no indication that they're willing to slow down that support, even in light of this type of language.
And Mary Beth, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said China can't enable the largest conflict in Europe in recent history without this negatively impacting their interest and reputation. What is your take on this? How should NATO deal with the China threat?
Well, I think the Brigadier General has it right. This is the second or third time that leadership in NATO have called out China, and it being not only the most critical enabler, but even the declaration goes on to say a threat to the Europeans. Without follow-up action, however, either from NATO itself or its membership, I think that the interpretation that she may get is that this is a bit of a paper tiger.
In general, Beijing has fired back at that today, accusing NATO of having what it calls a Cold War mentality. Now, we are currently seeing China and Belarus holding a joint drill just miles from Poland. But that aside, what can we expect from China?
I think they're going to do more of the same. They've, not only are supporting Russia in Europe, they're aggressive in Asia, they're supporting Iran and who's supporting Hamas in the Middle East. So, much like the Soviet Union was creating challenges for the free world and proxy states around, is basically taking over that mantle in what is, the second Cold War.
And Mary Beth, what about Russia? How might Russia respond to all of this?
Well, I think Russia is looking at this with perhaps a bit of bemusement, if not amusement. Look, at the same time China is exercising with Belarus, it's parked one of its largest ships just right off the coast of the Philippines. Russia, literally on the second day of the NATO meeting, possibly intentionally, missile attacked a hospital that had children in it in Kyiv and didn't even bother to pretend it was a mistake. I think at this point, Putin is going to do a wait and see, and he'll probably not get much of a response, and he will force, I think, additional conflict and additional confrontations.
General, speaking of Russia, during the summit, NATO members said Ukraine's path to the alliance is irreversible, but there is no specific timeline set, and President Biden has said Ukraine can't join until the war ends. How do you view the expansion of NATO to include Ukraine?
I think it's it's going nowhere fast. I think what we should be trying to pursue with regard to Ukraine is a ceasefire, something akin to what we had between South Korea and North Korea during the Korean War. And I think the issue of whether or not Ukraine joins NATO, it's going to follow peace, but peace is not going to come anytime soon. So we're going to be looking at this issue, this stalemate, if you will, for a long, long time to come.
Mary Beth, some analysts say it's not a good idea to promise Ukraine membership at all, even after the war is over. That's because it could incentivize Russia to continue the war. And once Ukraine does gain membership, NATO could be pulled into a war if Russia attacks Ukraine in the future. What do you make of that argument?
No, I don't accept that argument. Look, years ago in 2008, I was in the room when a number of nations, Ukraine and Georgia included, asked for NATO membership, and not promising at this stage NATO membership actually, I think, casts some doubt on whether any country has the ability to declare what organizations it wants to be part of and whether or not those organizations can accept it. We also have to understand that we take Putin at his word. This isn't about Ukraine. This is about Russia reattaining some of the republics that it got rid of or that left it after the demise of the Soviet Empire. I think a much more forceful response in this particular case, but I agree with the general. Status quo ante and a continued war of attrition is not going to serve anyone's purposes other than Putin's.
General, given the tensions we are seeing here, the war in the Middle East and tensions rising in Asia, what can the U.S. and allies do in terms of deterrence?
Well, I think, when you look at our international institutions today, by and large, they are supporting China and Russia in this conflict in Europe. And, what the United States has to do is get its mojo back. And really, in order to do that, I think it really needs to focus on building a strong coalition that's more economically intertwined and that is isolationist when it comes to dealing with China and Russia. If we continue to be aligned economically with China, we're going to funnel assets and resources into China and allow them to support Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So creating a strong coalition along the lines of the economic and military coalition that we had during the first Cold War is the beginning to strip away the global south from China's orbit.
Mary Beth, you've said before that when it comes to foreign affairs, perception is reality. Now, polls have shown that in recent years, especially after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the U.S. power projection is starting to recede globally. Given that, how can the U.S. return to that stature? What are the necessary steps for that?
Well, I think I was very surprised to hear a national leader of another country literally say during the NATO conference that after what they saw the U.S. do in Afghanistan, it is clear that the U.S. is in decline and that its power of projection and its power to influence is declining. Look, I agree. We have got to get serious about our defense. We've got to get serious about our relationships. We have fiddled around with half measures when it comes to Russia and sanctions. We have gone back and forth several times on Iran on sanctions regarding their nuclear program. We just aren't taken seriously. And we need a president and we need a nation that is taken very seriously, not only economically and security, but in the other domains where we are being challenged, like space and cyber.
In general, what about you? What do you see as the necessary steps the U.S. must take here?
The world is laughing at Joe Biden.
About changing the perception and changing the narrative. We had during the first Cold War something called the U.S. Information Agency, and we were much stronger with regard to public diplomacy. And I think now there's new tools like TikTok, and I think we do a very poor job of countering what is coming out of China and Russia and other bad actors. And so, we invented these technologies, so we ought to have a better grasp on how to muster global awareness and global support for our interests and our collective interests. And what I'm talking about here is the free world.
General Robert Spalding, Mary Beth Long, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Tensions in the South China Sea rising exponentially throughout the past year, mainly because of the relationship between China and the Philippines. But how did the long-running conflict begin? The other day, I spoke with retired Colonel Grant Newsham about the details. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy. Actually, give us a sense of when this conflict between the Philippines and China around the Scarborough Shoals started. When did this all begin?
Sure, actually, and that's important to actually consider some recent history here. In 2012, the Chinese moved in on a place called Scarborough Shoals. It's like a reef in Philippine territory. And the Filipinos sent out some Coast Guard ships, and they had a standoff. The Americans brokered a deal where both sides agreed to pull back. And what happened, of course, is the Filipinos pulled back. The Chinese did not, and they have stayed at Scarborough Shoals ever since. They effectively control Scarborough Shoals, which is Philippine territory. That was 2012. A few years later, the Americans encouraged the Filipinos to bring a lawsuit to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, an international body. And in 2016, that decision was made. It was overwhelmingly in the Philippines' favor. It demolished the Chinese claims and arguments that they owned parts of what are Philippine territory and other things the Chinese were doing in the South China Sea. The ruling came out and it vindicated the Filipinos basically and just savaged the Chinese. The Chinese said, scrap a piece of scrap paper. We don't believe it. We're not going to follow it. The Americans did nothing to help the Filipinos enforce this ruling. In fact, the Americans said purposely said nothing so that they wouldn't embarrass the Chinese, thinking the Chinese would appreciate the gesture. So that's 2 strikes when it comes to the Americans and the Filipinos. Now, about a year ago, the Chinese really started pressuring the Filipinos at Second Thomas Shoal. It's another reef within Philippine territory. There's a grounded Philippine ship there that has Marines and sailors on it, and that allows the Filipinos to demonstrate their control of that territory. The Chinese have just poured in ships and really have started to play rough. So the Filipinos can't get to that ship, and they need somebody to go with them. And that somebody has to be the Americans. The Americans have not stepped in here. So we're getting pretty close to strike 3 as far as the Filipinos see it. And that will leave pro-American Filipinos hanging with their domestic opposition saying, look, what the Americans do for you? Nothing. And all you've done is worsen relations with the Chinese. So our inaction is really having serious effects. And as I said, not just the Philippines, but elsewhere in the region. Our friends in other countries are watching to see what we do, and our enemies are watching the same thing.
A U.S. Coast Guard vessel encountered Chinese military ships within U.S. exclusive economic zone waters. The zone is considered international water. The U.S. exclusive economic zone spans 200 nautical miles from the U.S. coast. The vessel spotted 3 Chinese military ships off Alaska's Aleutian Islands. A Coast Guard helicopter spotted another Chinese vessel. The Coast Guard said yesterday the ships operated according to international standards. The U.S. responded with its own presence to ensure no disruptions to U.S. sea interests. Chinese naval ships have been spotted near Alaska before. In 2022, the Coast Guard found Chinese guided missile cruisers off Alaska, and in 2021, it encountered another set of Chinese ships in the area. Coming up in the NBA, could the league be on the cusp of a mammoth TV deal? Dave Martin joins us to discuss when we return.